My name is Celeste, and I was 32 years old when my father pressed an envelope into my hand at my own wedding reception and told me it was the last money he would ever give me. He didn't say it with anger. That's the part one keep coming back to. He said it the way he said most things. Evenly, with the particular confidence of a man who has never seriously entertained the possibility that he might be wrong about something. He pressed the envelope into my palm, closed my fingers around it, and said, "Last gift. After this, you're on your own. I want you to know I mean that." Marcus thanked him, looked him in the eye, shook his hand, and said, "Thank you, sir. We appreciate it." And he meant it. I knew that voice. I knew what genuine gratitude sounded like coming from him. He did not open the envelope. What my father didn't know that evening, what nobody in that room knew except me, and only partially, was that Marcus had been building something for 4 years that had nothing to do with my father's opinion of him. Something with his name on contracts my father would eventually need. 11 months later, at the grand opening of my father's most important project, the lobby told a story my father had not written. Let me tell you about the kind of family I grew up in, because without that context, the envelope scene doesn't make full sense. My father, Raymond Whitfield, built his name in commercial real estate development in Charlotte, North Carolina. Not residential, commercial. Office parks, mixed-use developments, the kind of projects that take 5 years from concept to ribbon cutting and require the patience of someone who can hold a vision across budget cycles and zoning hearings and contractor disputes without losing the thread. He was good at it. He had started with a 2-person operation in a strip mall office in the early 90s and had grown it over 30 years into a firm with 11 employees and a project portfolio that the Charlotte Business Journal covered as a matter of course. He was not famous. He was known, which in that world is the thing that actually matters. My mother, Diane, had been his office manager for the first 8 years of the business and his wife for 31. She was the kind of woman who made things run without requiring acknowledgement for the running of them. She had a particular gift for the operational texture of life that I recognized in myself later and understood, only in retrospect, as its own form of competence. She had stepped back from the business when I was born and had not, as far as I could tell, regretted it. She found her own work in the community organizations she ran with the same quiet efficiency she had applied to Raymond's office. She was not a pushover. She was simply someone who had chosen her battles so carefully over so many years that she no longer appeared to be in any battles at all. I was their only child. I studied civil engineering at NC State, a choice my father respected because it touched his world, and a choice I made because I was genuinely interested in the structural systems that buildings rested on, the unglamorous load-bearing reality underneath the architectural surface. I graduated and went to work for a structural engineering firm in Charlotte, which was practical and proximate, and which my father parsed as confirmation that I would eventually fold into his business in some form. I was not opposed to that, exactly. I simply had not decided yet. What I had decided in the 4 years I worked at that firm was what kind of work I found meaningful. It was the fabrication side that pulled me, not the design, not the project management, but the actual production of structural steel components, the translation from engineering drawing to fabricated piece. There was a problem in the industry I kept encountering: the gap between what an engineer specified and what a fabricator could efficiently produce within a given budget and timeline. That gap cost projects money and time, consistently, in ways that felt like a solvable problem that nobody had fully solved because the engineers and the fabricators were operating in different professional languages. I did not solve that problem myself. I met the person who was solving it. I want to tell you about my grandfather before I tell you about Marcus, because he is the reason I understood what I was seeing when I saw it. His name was August Whitfield, my father's father, and he had been a structural ironworker for 38 years before his retirement. He had worked on buildings across the Carolinas and Virginia, had been on the crew for several projects my father later developed adjacent to, and had spent his working life doing the physical labor that made the things my father sold possible. My father respected this history in the abstract way that successful people sometimes respect the working-class origins they have traveled away from, genuinely but at a distance, with a quality of filed-away reverence that doesn't fully integrate with the present tense. My grandfather respected it differently. He lived in it. He talked about steel the way other people talked about language, as a medium with its own grammar, its own demands, its own way of telling you when you had gotten something right and when you hadn't. He died when I was 27, 2 years before I met Marcus. He left me 3 things: his work boots, which I kept on a shelf in my apartment and later in the house Marcus and I shared, his annotated copy of a structural steel design manual he had carried for 30 years, and a specific piece of advice he had given me when I was 22 and starting my engineering career, which was this: the people who build the thing and the people who sell the thing have been talking past each other your whole life. The person who learns both languages will own the room. I thought about that for 5 years before I understood what he meant. I met Marcus Tran at a structural fabrication conference in Raleigh when I was 29. He was presenting on a software system he had developed for translating structural engineering specifications into fabrication-ready models, the exact problem I had been watching the industry fail to solve for 4 years. I sat in the back of the room and listened to him describe the gap I had been cataloging in my own head and the solution he had built for it, and I had the specific experience of hearing someone articulate something you had not been able to articulate yourself. We talked for an hour after his presentation. He was 35, Vietnamese American, had grown up in Greensboro, had a mechanical engineering background, and had spent 8 years working in fabrication shops before building the software from the inside of the problem rather than the outside. He was not performing expertise. He had it in the particular embodied way that comes from having done the physical work before the theoretical work, from having held the steel before writing the code about it. I told my father about him 3 months into dating. Raymond was polite. He asked what Marcus did, and I explained it, and my father nodded in the way he nodded when he was filing something under adjacent but not central. He asked what firm Marcus worked for. I said Marcus was independent. He had left his last employer 2 years earlier to build the software full-time. My father asked what his revenue looked like. I said it was early. My father said, "So, he's in the startup phase." I said yes. He said, "That's a precarious place to be for an extended period." I said I knew. That was the first conversation. They did not improve significantly over the next 2 years. To be precise about what my father saw when he looked at Marcus, he saw a man in his mid-30s without a salary, without a company behind him, without the conventional markers of professional arrival. Marcus drove a truck that was 8 years old. He lived in a rented house in East Raleigh. He wore Carhartt work shirts to the fabrication shops he visited for client meetings and Oxford shirts to everything else, and neither wardrobe announced anything my father recognized as success. He was not dismissive of Marcus in the way that some parents are dismissive. He never said anything overtly contemptuous. He was simply operating on a set of metrics that Marcus did not register on, and he was too certain of those metrics to question whether they were the right ones. Marcus knew this.
He was not troubled by it.
He had spent 8 years in fabrication shops, which is an environment that has its own hierarchy entirely separate from the one my father operated in, and he had the particular groundedness of someone who has been measured by a rubric that mattered and passed it. My father's rubric was, to Marcus, simply another instrument he didn't happen to be calibrated for. We dated for 2.5 years before he proposed. By the time he did, the software had 3 paying clients, structural engineering firms in North Carolina and Virginia, who had licensed it on annual contracts. Not large contracts. Between the 3 of them, approximately $180,000 in annual recurring revenue. Enough to prove the concept. Not enough to impress my father, who was, by that point, in pre-development on the largest project of his career, a mixed-use luxury residential and retail tower in the South End neighborhood of Charlotte, 21 stories, a project he had been working toward for 6 years, the thing he talked about at every family dinner as the building that would be his legacy. Marcus proposed on a Saturday morning in the kitchen of our apartment in Raleigh. No production, no audience, just him and me, and the coffee going cold while he said what he wanted to say. He had my grandmother's ring, which his own mother had quietly offered when she learned we were serious, a pearl set in white gold that I found more beautiful than anything I would have chosen. He said, "I want to build this life with you. I think we're good at it already." I said yes before he finished the sentence. We were married 9 months later, in May, in Charlotte, a ceremony of 60 people, an outdoor venue in Noda that a college friend had recommended, simple and warm and ours. My father paid for the reception, which was generous and which I accepted as the expression of love it genuinely was, even knowing that it would arrive with its own accounting. The accounting arrived at 8:30 in the evening. The reception had been going for 2 hours when my father found me near the edge of the dance floor. Marcus was across the room talking to his mother and his 2 older brothers, who had driven down from Greensboro with their families, and my father appeared at my elbow with the specific bearing of a man who has decided to do something and is going to do it before the moment passes. He had an envelope in his breast pocket. He produced it and held it in both hands for a moment before extending it to me, a gesture that had the quality of a prepared thing, something he had thought about in advance. "I want to give you this," he said. "And I want to say something to go with it." I took the envelope. It was sealed. "Your mother and I have been thinking about how to handle this," he said, and his voice had that particular evenness it took on when he was being what he considered honest. "We have supported you your whole life. That support has always come with the understanding that you would be building toward something. A career. A partnership. A life that has solid ground under it." I was watching him. "We love you," he said. "That doesn't change. But I want to be direct with you because I think direct is what you've always needed from me. I have concerns about Marcus's situation. He's a good man, I believe that. But good intentions and a software product with 3 clients is not a foundation. Not the kind of foundation this family has always stood on." He paused. "What's in that envelope is a wedding gift, and it's the last financial support you'll receive from us. I want you to know that clearly going in. After tonight, you're on your own." He said it without cruelty. That is the precise and important truth of it. He said it with the measured gravity of a man delivering what he genuinely believed was a useful and honest thing, the kind of directness he had always prided himself on, the kind he had built a business on. He was not trying to hurt me. He had simply decided that I needed to hear this, and that a wedding reception was not too public a place to say it, because the message was for me and not for the room. I looked at him for a moment. I felt something move through my chest. Not grief, not quite, but the specific sensation of a door closing that you had known was going to close and had hoped, despite knowing, might stay open.
"Thank you, Dad," I said.
He squeezed my arm. He went to find my mother. I held the envelope and I stood at the edge of the dance floor, and I watched the room for a moment. The tables with their centerpieces, Marcus's brother laughing at something, the band playing something low and easy, and then I walked across to where Marcus was standing. He looked at the envelope in my hand. "For my father," I said.
"He took it from me."
He turned it over once, looked at my father's handwriting on the front, my name, in block letters, and then he looked at me. "Did he say something?" "He said it was the last gift." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he looked across the room at my father, who was now at the bar with 2 of his business colleagues, and he said, evenly and without any visible shading of bitterness, "I appreciate him giving it." He set the envelope on our table, between the place cards. He did not open it. I want to be precise about that. He did not open it that night. He did not open it the following morning. He put it in the top drawer of his desk in our home office in Raleigh, where it stayed for the next 11 months. Not as a statement. Not as a protest. Simply because it was my father's accounting of what Marcus was worth, and Marcus had his own accounting, and he did not need my father's to know the difference. The weeks after the wedding had the texture that weeks after weddings often have, a kind of returning to scale, the ordinary dimensions of a life reasserting themselves after the enlarged proportions of a major event. We settled into our house. I went back to my engineering firm. Marcus went back to his software, which was at that point in a period of specific and purposeful expansion that I watched from close proximity, without fully understanding the pace of it until later. I should tell you what Marcus was building in those 11 months, because it matters for what happened in the lobby. The problem his software solved was not a small one. Structural steel fabrication is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States, and the inefficiency gap between engineering specification and fabrication production, the gap my grandfather had described to me in a different language when I was 22, costs the industry an estimated several $100 million annually in rework, delays, and miscommunication costs. Marcus had spent 8 years building a solution from the inside, and the 3-client proof of concept he had at our wedding was, it turned out, the inflection point. In the 6 months after our wedding, 4 new firms licensed the software. 2 of them were mid-sized structural engineering firms. One was a large general contractor with projects across the Southeast who used it to coordinate between their engineering team and their fabrication subs. One was a structural steel fabrication company, a real one, not a small shop, a company with a regional footprint and the kind of client list that other companies on that list pay attention to. I knew about each of these. Marcus told me when each contract was signed, at our kitchen table, or on the phone when I was traveling for work, and I held each one with the specific satisfaction of having watched someone do something slowly and correctly and arrive, without announcement, at the place the work was always pointed. What I did not track, because I was not tracking it, was the overlap between Marcus's growing client roster and the specific subcontractor relationships on my father's South End tower. I learned about that overlap on a Wednesday evening in March, 11 months after the wedding, when Marcus came home from a site visit in Charlotte and said, over dinner, that he had spent the afternoon at the fabrication shop that was doing the structural steel work on my father's building. I set down my fork. He said, they came to me 6 weeks ago. I didn't make the connection immediately. Your father's development company isn't listed on their client manifest. It's the general contractor. I only put it together when I saw the project address on their specs. I looked at him across our kitchen table. Does the GC know who your wife is? I don't know, he said. It hasn't come up. Does the fabrication shop?
No.
Does my father know you're working with them? Marcus shook his head once. There's no reason he would. My contracts are with the subs, not with the developer. I thought about this for a long moment. The South End Tower was my father's legacy project. He had talked about it at every family dinner for 6 years. He was 4 months from the grand opening. Do you want to withdraw? I asked. Marcus looked at me with the same expression he had worn at the reception when he set the envelope on the table. Even. Settled. The face of a man who did not need the room's opinion to know what the room contained. The work is real, he said. The contract is legitimate. The fabrication shop is producing better results with the software than they were before.
He paused.
Do you want me to withdraw? I thought about my grandfather's work boots on the shelf in my office. I thought about 11 months of sitting across from this man at a kitchen table and watching him build something real.
No, I said.
Do the work. The grand opening invitation arrived the following week. My father's grand opening for the South End Tower. He had named it the Whitfield South End, which was the kind of naming decision that tells you everything you need to know about how a person relates to their own legacy, was scheduled for a Saturday morning in April. A ribbon cutting at 10, followed by a hard hat tour for investors and press, followed by a catered lunch in the lobby for a list of approximately 90 guests, city council members, business partners, subcontractors, press, and selected members of the Charlotte commercial real estate community who had watched the project develop. My mother called to invite us. It was, I noticed, my mother who called rather than my father, which was the pattern for anything that required navigation. My mother was the one who made the calls that maintained the form of a relationship my father had, at the wedding reception, renegotiated the terms of. He'd like you there, she said. Both of you. It's important to him. I said we'd be there. I told Marcus that evening. He was at his desk in the home office, and he looked up from his laptop and said, when? I told him. He nodded once and looked at his laptop for a moment. I should tell you, the fabrication shop is going to have a representative there. They're one of the featured subcontractors in the lobby display. I took that in slowly. A lobby display. Your father's team put together a folder for investors and press. It includes the key subcontractors and their contributions to the project. The fabrication shop is in it. Their contract documentation is in it. I looked at him. He said, my name is on that documentation, as the software consultant of record. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the shape of something reveals itself completely. I said, does anyone in my father's orbit know that? I don't know, Marcus said. I don't believe anyone has looked that closely at the fabrication shop's internal documentation, but it's there. I sat with that for a long moment. Marcus closed his laptop and looked at me steadily, waiting without pressuring, the way he always waited. We go, I said finally. We just go. He nodded. Okay. We drove down to Charlotte on a Saturday morning in April. I wore a pale gray dress and my grandmother's pearl ring, the one Marcus had proposed with, moved from my right hand to my left where it lived alongside my wedding band. Marcus wore a navy suit, no tie, the way he dressed for professional events where he wanted to be taken seriously without performing anything. The South End Tower was, in every objective sense, impressive. 21 stories of glass and steel in a neighborhood that had been industrial 20 years ago and was now one of Charlotte's most developed corridors. The lobby was exactly what my father had described at every dinner for 6 years. High ceilings, a specific grade of marble, the kind of proportions that make a person stop when they walk in and register, wordlessly, that something has been built here with intention. My father was near the entrance when we arrived, in a charcoal suit and the particular expression of a man receiving congratulations he has spent a long time earning. He shook hands with Marcus when we arrived, a correct, measured handshake, and told me the building had turned out better than he'd hoped, which was the closest he came to joy in professional settings. My mother found us within minutes and hugged me with a warmth that was, as always, entirely unguarded. The guests moved through the lobby in the unhurried way of a morning event with coffee and pastries available. The mayor's development liaison spoke briefly at a small podium near the elevator bank. The project's general contractor said a few words, and then my father gave remarks that I had heard elements of at every dinner for 6 years and which were, nonetheless, earned. He had built this thing. He had held it across 6 years of obstacles. Whatever else was true, that was real. After the remarks, the guests were directed toward the investor and press materials displayed on a long table along the east wall of the lobby. My father's team had done this well. Architectural drawings, timeline graphics, a brief history of the development process, and, in a thick cream-colored folder embossed with a Whitfield South End logo, the project documentation that included the key contractor and subcontractor relationships. Marcus and I were standing near the windows when I watched the general contractor, a man named Phil Garrett who had been my father's GC on 3 previous projects, pick up one of the folders and begin to page through it. I watched Phil Garrett's hand stop turning pages. He looked at a page. He looked at it for a moment longer than pages usually hold attention. Then he looked across the lobby toward Marcus, who was standing beside me talking to one of my father's associates about something unrelated, entirely at ease, entirely unaware that Phil Garrett was currently reading his name off a subcontractor documentation sheet. Phil Garrett walked toward us. I felt the air in the room shift, not literally, but in the way that a room shifts when the center of gravity moves without announcement. Phil Garrett was 61 years old and had been a general contractor in the Charlotte commercial market for 35 years. He was not a man who performed surprise. He had the permanent pragmatism of someone who had been solving construction problems for 3 decades and had long since stopped being surprised by anything a building could present him with. Which is why the expression on his face as he crossed the lobby was notable. It was not surprise exactly, but the specific alertness of a man who has encountered an unexpected data point and is moving toward it to verify. He stopped in front of Marcus and put out his hand. "Marcus Tran," he said. Marcus shook it.
Phil, good to see you.
They knew each other. Of course they knew each other. Phil Garrett's GC firm had been one of Marcus's early contacts in the Southeast market, and Marcus had done preliminary conversations with Phil's team 2 years earlier, before the South End project was in full swing. I had not known this until that moment. Marcus had not mentioned it because there had been nothing to mention, an early conversation, nothing formalized, a contact in the industry. Phil Garrett said, "I didn't know you were here." Marcus said, "Celeste is Raymond's daughter." Phil Garrett's eyes moved to me. "Raymond's," he stopped. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the folder in his hand. He said, "You're the consultant of record on the Piedmont fabrication contract." Marcus said, "That's right." Phil Garrett was quiet for a moment in the way a very organized mind goes quiet when it is reorganizing. "Your software, they implemented it for the steel package on this building." "They did," Marcus said. Phil Garrett looked at the folder in his hand with an expression that had something specific in it. The look of a man who has just understood that a result he had been pleased with. The fabrication package on this building had come in under budget and ahead of schedule, which in commercial construction is a genuinely remarkable outcome, had a cause he had not previously identified. The steel package on this building was the cleanest I've worked with in 15 years, Phil Garrett said. I told Raymond that at closeout. He thought it was the fabrication shop's new management. It was partly that, Marcus said, without inflating. The software helps, but the shop has to be willing to use it correctly. Piedmont's team did. Phil Garrett nodded slowly. He said, "You should talk to Raymond." Marcus said, "I'll let that develop naturally." I had not moved during this exchange. I was standing to Marcus's right with my coffee cup in both hands, watching Phil Garrett's face do the work that the room was now beginning to do, the recalibration, the resorting of a set of conclusions that had been organized around one set of facts and were now encountering a different set. I looked across the lobby. My father was 20 feet away, talking to the city council liaison and a woman I recognized as the architecture firm's principal. He was in full professional command, the posture of a man at his own event, comfortable in the proportions of it. And then Phil Garrett raised his hand in my father's direction. The universal signal of a man who has something to show you. My father excused himself from the council liaison and crossed the lobby toward us. His face had the pleasant openness of a host greeting guests, right up until the moment he registered who Phil was standing with, and then something in that openness went through a transition I watched happen across his face like weather moving across an open field. Not collapse. My father does not collapse in public. But a rearrangement. A resettlement of the features around a new piece of information. He stopped in front of Marcus. Phil Garrett said, "Raymond, I want to introduce you properly to Celeste's husband. I've been looking at the subcontractor documentation, and it turns out Marcus is the consultant of record on the Piedmont fabrication contract. His software system is what produced the clean steel package I told you about at closeout." My father stood very still. It was not the stillness of a man processing good news, exactly. It was the stillness of a man processing a collision, the specific collision between what he had decided 11 months ago with an envelope in his breast pocket and what the lobby documentation was now telling him. He looked at the folder Phil was holding. Phil opened it to the relevant page and held it toward him. My father looked at the page. He looked at Marcus's name, printed there in the standard typeface of a professional contract document, attached to a deliverable that his own general contractor had just described as the cleanest steel package he had worked with in 15 years. He looked at Marcus. Marcus held his gaze with the same even quality he brought to everything. Not triumphant. Not performing patience. Simply there, present. The same man he had always been in every room my father had encountered him in, with the difference that the room now contained a document. My father said, quietly, "Not for the lobby, not for Phil Garrett, just for the three of us. When did you start working with Piedmont?" Marcus said, "About 7 months ago. The GC contact came through a referral. I didn't know it was your project until I saw the address on their specs." My father absorbed this. Phil Garrett said, "The fabrication savings on that steel package were significant, Raymond. I flagged them in the closeout report. Came in 11% under the bid." My father said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the page in the folder with the expression of a man reading something that is reorganizing the furniture in a room he thought he knew the layout of. Then he closed the folder, carefully, and handed it back to Phil. He looked at Marcus. He said, "I didn't know you were working on this building." Marcus said, "I know." Silence, 4 seconds, 5, in which the lobby continued its business around us. Guests moving toward the pastry table, someone asking a question of the project architect, the ambient sound of an event proceeding on its own momentum. Then my father said, to no one in particular, in a voice that had gone somewhere quieter than his usual register, "The steel package was the thing I was proudest of on this building." Marcus said nothing.
He did not need to.
I picked up my coffee cup and took a sip and looked out the lobby windows of the South End neighborhood, the buildings my father had spent 6 years watching go up around his own, the city doing what cities do. My father went quiet for a long time. Phil Garrett spent the next 20 minutes introducing Marcus to 3 other people at that event. I watched this happen from a comfortable distance. I was talking to my mother, who had found me near the pastry table with the particular radar she deployed at events where she sensed that something significant had shifted. She did not know, yet, exactly what had shifted. She knew the geometry of me well enough to read that something had. "How are you doing?" she asked. It was the question that meant something other than the words. "I'm good, Mom," I said. And I meant it. Phil introduced Marcus to the architecture firm's principal, who had a project in pre-development in Ballantyne and had been looking, she mentioned, for a consultant who could help bridge the gap between her specs and the fabrication shop she was planning to use. Phil introduced him to one of my father's investors, a man named George Tatum, who had capital in 4 of my father's projects and who listened to Marcus's 2-sentence explanation of what the software did with the focused attention of a man who has just been shown a solution to a problem he has been paying for without naming. George Tatum said, "Can I get your card?" Marcus produced one from his jacket pocket. He had brought exactly 6. He gave out 4 of them at that event. My father moved through the remainder of the morning doing what my father always did at his own events, hosting with professional competence, receiving congratulations with the measured warmth of a man who has worked for this moment and is determined to inhabit it correctly. He did not return to the conversation by the lobby display table. He did not seek out Marcus again during the event. He was doing, I understood, what he always did when he encountered information that required recalibration. He was filing it, organizing it, preparing to engage with it on his own terms and in his own time. He called me on the following Thursday. Not my mother, not through an intermediary. My father, directly, at 7 in the evening, when I was in the kitchen making dinner and Marcus was in the home office finishing a call. "I've been thinking about last Saturday," he said. "I thought you might be," I said. "Phil Garrett called me on Monday," he said. "He wanted to talk about the fabrication consultant." A pause. "He told me he'd reached out to Marcus about the Ballantyne project." "I heard that," I said. Another pause. My father had a specific rhythm to pauses. They were not empty, they were organizing. "I owe you a direct conversation," he said. "And I owe Marcus one." I said, "I think that's right." He said, "The envelope." The things I said at the reception. "Yes," I said. "I want to be honest with you," he said, and I recognized this as a version of the sentence he had used at the reception. The same reach for candor that was in him, as genuine as anything he had, but arriving, this time, from a different direction. I made that assessment based on what I could see, what I could measure. I didn't ask the right questions, and I didn't have the right information, and I said it in a place and in a way that he stopped. "That wasn't fair to either of you." I set my spatula down on the counter. "Thank you for saying that, Dad. I want to have you both to dinner," he said. "I want to do it properly. I want to talk to Marcus about his work, actually talk to him, not," another pause, "not the way I have been." "I'll ask him," I said. Marcus, when I told him, was quiet for a moment. He was still at his desk, the call finished, the office lamp making a warm circle in the evening dark. Then he said, "Okay." I said, "Just okay?" He said, "I've never needed him to understand what I'm doing. But if he wants to, I'm not going to stand in the way of that." The dinner happened 2 weeks later, at my parents' house in Myers Park. My mother's domain, her kitchen, her table, which mattered because it meant she had chosen this, had set it with intention, had made it a thing she was part of rather than a backdrop to. She made my grandmother's recipe for jollof rice alongside the roast she knew my father expected at a serious dinner, and the combination of those 2 choices was its own kind of statement. My father asked Marcus, over the first course, to explain the software. Not the pitch meeting version, the real version. Marcus talked for 15 minutes with the specificity of someone who had spent 8 years inside the problem. My father listened with the quality of attention I had watched him apply to engineering proposals, to contractor presentations, to the technical dimensions of his own projects. He asked 2 questions that were good questions, the kind of questions that demonstrate genuine engagement rather than performed interest. At the end of the evening, my father said, "I'd like to talk to George Tatum about his pipeline. He has 3 projects coming up that might be relevant. If you're open to it." Marcus said, "I'm open to it." My father nodded. "I should have asked you these questions 3 years ago. I'm saying that without any qualification." Marcus said, I appreciate that.
My father looked at me.
I meant what I said at the reception. I meant it as an honest assessment of what I could see. I was wrong about what I could see. Those are different things, but I understand they both landed the same way. I looked at him for a moment. There was something in his face I had not seen in exactly this form before. Not humility, exactly, which was not in his nature, but a specific kind of recalibration that was its own form of honesty. The list, updated. The evidence, incorporated. I know the difference, I said. After dinner, while Marcus and my father were in the living room continuing a conversation about the Ballantine project, my mother came to stand beside me at the kitchen counter, where I was helping her with the dishes. She said, without looking at me, "He's been up since 5 every morning this week." I said, "I know what that means." She said, "He is trying." A pause. "He's not fast at it, but he is trying." I put my hand over hers on the edge of the sink. The envelope, as it turned out, had contained a check for $15,000. Marcus found this when he finally opened it, 3 weeks after the grand opening, on a Sunday morning, at our kitchen table, with me sitting across from him. He looked at the amount, looked at me, and said, "Deposit it?" I said, "Deposit it."
He did.
We used it to replace the gutters on our house, which needed replacing, which is about as ordinary a use as you can make of a thing that was meant to be a verdict. In the months that followed, Marcus had 2 conversations with George Tatum, both facilitated by my father, both of which resulted in preliminary discussions about upcoming projects. Phil Garrett referred him to a structural engineering firm in Greensboro. The architecture principal from the grand opening became a formal client in September. My father and Marcus had breakfast together for the first time in November, just the 2 of them. A diner near my father's office, Marcus's idea, which I learned about afterward when Marcus came home and told me it had gone well. I asked what they talked about. He said, buildings. Load-bearing systems. The problem of the gap between engineering and fabrication, which my father, it turned out, had encountered from the developer side and had opinions about that were, Marcus said, not entirely wrong. I thought about my grandfather, August Whitfield, and the manual he had carried for 30 years with his annotations in the margins. I thought about the sentence he had said to me when I was 22 about the person who learns both languages owning the room. My grandfather had been an ironworker. My father built buildings. My husband built the system that made the steel, and the blueprints speak the same language. The room, eventually, understood all 3 of those facts at the same time. My grandfather August worked with structural steel for 38 years. He never once described that work as beneath anything. He understood in a way my father had traveled away from and was now, slowly, traveling back toward, that the people who build the thing and the people who sell the thing are not in different leagues. They are in the same building on different floors, and the whole structure depends on both of them doing their work correctly. What I know now, standing on the other side of everything I've described, is this. The people who hand you an envelope with a verdict inside have already decided what you're worth. But decisions made without the full information are not verdicts.
They are just early drafts.
The final draft writes itself, eventually, in contract documentation, in closeout reports, in the quiet of a lobby when a man reads a page and goes still. You don't have to write it. You just have to do the work long enough for the page to get there. That's my story. A sealed envelope on a wedding table, a pair of ironworker's boots on a shelf in my office, and a line in a lobby folder that nobody asked me to put there. Here's what I've been thinking about since, and I want to know what you would have done. Marcus held that envelope for 11 months without opening it. He didn't need to know what was inside, because he already knew what it meant. If someone handed you a sealed verdict like that, at your own wedding, in front of your family, would you have opened it right then? Or would you have done what Marcus did and set it down, and let the work answer for itself? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.